7 Famous Moonshiners. WHO changed Appalachia. Moonshine Life Recipes Group. By J.B. Wagonmaker. White Lightning. Mountain Dew. Corn Liquor. Moonshine. Every family has its word for it. You've heard some of the stories. From federal raids on moonshine stills down in the holler to police chases on the backroads of Appalachia and the Smoky Mountains, moonshiners have been forever burned into the memory and culture of the Appalachian people. It's more than an illegal activity, it's a way of life, it's a symbol of freedom. It became the spark that would lead to the invention of a national sport, NASCAR, as a way to keep moonshiners' cars in top shape to outrun the government. Moonshining fused into Appalachian pop culture early on and continues to be a war cry of the mountain man. Whether it's the Osborne brothers' famous line, "Once two strangers climbed Old Rocky Top, looking for a moonshine still, strangers ain't come down from Rocky Top, reckon they never will," Steve Earle's Copperhead Road, or the numerous appearances the topic makes in film and TV, moonshining is mountain culture. Born out of a necessity to make extra money for their families, moonshiners have distilled, packaged, and sold Mountain Dew for hundreds of years in America. While moonshining has been illegal for the majority of the existence of the United States, mainly because the government has to squeeze every bit of tax money out of the working man while it watches corporations never pay a dime, the late 1800s and early 1900s are known for the sheer amount of moonshiners and bootleggers in action. Throughout the years, there have been a group of moonshiners that stood out above the rest. They are the fathers of moonshine and are the subjects of their legends. Here are their stories. Buck O Heron. Born into a poor family in Boonville, North Carolina in 1837, Buck O Heron grew up tending to the family's corn farm. From an early age, he learned about moonshining from another local farm. O Heron would take what he learned and put himself to work moonshining on his family's property. When the Civil War broke out, Buck O Heron had already become one of the most infamous moonshiners in the state of North Carolina. Most moonshiners favored the Confederacy in the war for the simple reason that any taxes they owed from making moonshine would disappear in the Confederate States of America. As the war winded down and the writing was on the wall, moonshiners fled the Smoky Mountains and Appalachia in search of greener pastures in the West. Buck did not. He chose to stay and continue to shine. His operation had grown so massive that he produced 60 gallons of whiskey a day, an unfathomable number for that time. This led to O Heron giving away many gallons to war vets and friends. In 1874, one of Buck's stills exploded and caused a great fire on the property. This was enough to change Buck's priorities, as he would no longer produce moonshine. Instead, he would create a non-alcoholic drink called Sunshine. About a decade later in 1892, Buck O Heron would disappear from the face of the planet, never to be seen again. His body was never found, and no one knows what happened to him. However, a group of hikers did stumble over a cask with the initials Bo carved into it in 2011, which is thought to be O Heron's. Charles Folias. Not much is known about Charles Folias' life as a moonshiner. We do know he was from the mountains of North Carolina and has a particularly interesting legend around him. Folias was known to many as the Whiskey Caveman, a moniker he would have for most of his distilling career. Folias had a history of federal raids on his property, but every time the authorities showed up, they couldn't find him or any evidence of illegal moonshine. It turns out Charles Folias built his moonshine distillery inside a cave on his property. When the tax agents would come, he would disappear into the cave, never to be found. Unfortunately, his luck would quickly run out. During one federal raid, Folias fled into his cave like he had time and time again, but this time he was confronted by a group of rattlesnakes blocking his path. He realized he had two choices: run through the snakes and get bit, or turn around and face the law. He chose to face the law to save his life. The legend of Charles Folias lives on in Appalachian folklore for his unique adventures as a moonshiner. Amos Owens. Born in 1822 in North Carolina, Amos Owens, aka the Cherry Bounce King, grew up in the mountains with no formal education. At the ripe age of 9, he began working on a local farm, where he remained in employment until the age of 22 when he had saved up enough money to buy himself 100 acres of land on Cherry Mountain, North Carolina. Owens had been making moonshine for most of his life and became known from the East Coast to the Mississippi River as the Cherry Bounce King, an allusion to his famous alcoholic drink that was made from corn whiskey, cherries, and sugar water. After serving in the Confederate Army and spending most of his time as a Union prisoner, Owens returned to his acreage on Cherry Mountain vowing to never pay another dime in federal taxes. Amos Owens's popularity went through an even bigger boom period when he started his famous June celebration where he would offer all the Cherry Bounce a person could drink for a mere 25 cents. Cherry Bounce became a well-known drink across every saloon and tavern in the southeastern United States. As the story goes, Amos would use a telescope to spot approaching federal agents. However, one day, they got through. When they approached his house, he offered them breakfast and Cherry Bounce. Obliging, the agents consumed their fill and became drunk. Rather than run, Amos Owens waited until the revenue men sobered up enough to take him in. Owens spent a significant amount of time in prison over his years as a moonshiner. His final stint in prison was late in his life, which led to Owens ending his moonshining operations in favor of a simpler life. Although Owens died in 1906, the cherries on Cherry Mountain still grow to this day, in remembrance of an infamous moonshiner. Robert Glenn Johnson Sr., known as simply Sr., and later, the second-to-last American hero, Robert Glenn Johnson is most famous for being the father of Junior Johnson. But he left his mark as a moonshiner and bootlegger himself. Sr. grew up in North Carolina during the Great Depression, and his story followed the stories of many other moonshiners throughout history. To make extra cash from the corn crops, Johnson Sr. began making moonshine. Sr. had become such an infamous moonshiner that the revenue agents were always on his tail. He spent over 1/3 of his life in prison for various charges related to moonshining and bootlegging. His legacy would be teaching his son to moonshine and evade the cops at all costs, skills that would propel his son into being one of the greatest NASCAR drivers of all time. Robert Glenn Johnson Jr., much like his father, Jr., would quickly become one of the fastest bootleggers in the history of the tradition. From an early age, Jr. remembers all the run-ins his father had with the revenue men, and vowed to continue the family business. In all his years as a bootlegger, Jr. only went to prison once, and it was for operating an illegal still. He was never caught by the cops while burning rubber down the hollers and hills. In 1955, Jr. joined NASCAR and won 5 races in his first year. He was notorious for using NASCAR to keep his bootlegging car in top shape for escaping the feds. Jr. and his dad are responsible for the inundation of other bootleggers into NASCAR circuit racing for the same reasons. Known by many as the last American hero, Jr. is the main reason why moonshining is as culturally popular as it is today. Eric Digger Maines. Eric Maines is considered to be a part of the modern era of moonshining. He has been distilling whiskey for over 40 years, since the 1970s. At the age of 14, he found a family friend to teach him the moonshining trade. Since then he has become a master distiller and spent many years working with Popcorn Sutton. Maines was known to idolize Sutton and other moonshiners who came before him. He claims he didn't shine for the money, but the tradition. As his family grew with a new baby boy, Maines ended his career as a moonshiner just before Sutton was charged and convicted by the feds. But the story doesn't end there. Maines went on to star in the popular Discovery Channel show, Moonshiners. He has since gone on to run his store that sells beer and winemaking supplies. He hopes to bring some tourism to Newport, Tennessee, and revitalize the rural town. Marvin, Popcorn, Sutton. Last but certainly not least is the infamous Popcorn, Sutton, who is probably the most well-known moonshiner in the history of Appalachia, but definitely of the Smoky Mountains. Born in 1946 in Maggie Valley, North Carolina, Sutton was a lifetime moonshiner and certified rebel of the Smoky Mountains. He learned the trade at an early age not due to the promise of money or fame, but because he thought it was crucial to carry on the traditions that his ancestors had been a part of for generations. Beyond moonshine, Sutton was known for his upbeat, vulgar, and direct attitude. He was a funny man who considered himself to be a simple mountain man. In 1999, he wrote an autobiography and produced his own documentary titled Me and My Liquor, which was sold in thrift stores throughout the region, but never received any sort of real press. Over the years, he had been arrested for selling liquor and a few other crimes. He starred in a couple of other documentary movies, including the famous classic This Is the Last Damn Run of Liquor I'll Ever Make, in which cameras filmed him making a batch of his famous moonshine. While Sutton had been a local legend for years, serving among the folklore stories of the Smoky Mountains more so than anything real, his climb to national fame came when he was being charged and prosecuted for federal moonshining and firearm crimes. The nation got behind Sutton and supported him as his property was raided by the ATF. Interestingly enough, the ATF goons included Jim Kavanaugh, who was part of the Waco disaster some years before. The federal government needed Sutton as a scapegoat. After pleading guilty to the charges, Sutton asked for leniency from the judge as he was recently diagnosed with cancer. The judge shamelessly refused, bringing down an 18-month prison sentence on Sutton in federal prison. Rather than suffer his fate and most likely die in prison, Sutton chose to go out on his terms by taking his own life in 2009, at the age of 69. The feds got what they wanted, as Sutton had become a scapegoat for every single moonshiner in the history of the tradition. They wanted Sutton's story to serve as the end of moonshining and the culture it created. While the press may say that moonshining is dead, Sutton's treatment by the government only grew the fire that mountain men have in their belly. The burning desire to remain free from government intervention and pursue a life worth living lives on throughout every holler and hill in the Smoky Mountains and beyond. Sutton solidified his legendary status through his death as a martyr for the traditions and ancestral history he so furiously believed in. His story will live on in the mountains forever. Culture, heritage, and tradition have always been a massive part of the mountain man's ethos. It lives inside every man and woman in the hills. They hold these traditions close to their hearts and pass them down from generation to generation, as is their right. For some, moonshining is simply a criminal act, and it can be that simple in many cases. But for these influential shiners, it was more. It became a symbol of freedom, for the right to live as their ancestors did. There's something to be said for maintaining that sort of connection with the people who lived in the mountains before. Too often, our connection to the past is severed. Perhaps one day we will be able to find the proper balance between the past and the present, but for now, at least acknowledge what came before so you can prepare for what is to come. Enjoy Moonshine Life Recipes.